Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pracademia and Education Identity Community Engagement session. We're going to start by sharing some of the definitions around pracademia and pracademics. So it's a very long history, full 30 years that we've seen the publication of the term pracademic. Early 90s is when it started to make appearance in the social sciences and budgeting, management, law, etc. But mostly the definitions that we've seen, and particularly Posner's 2009 definition, talked about the pracademic, the individual, and exploring what it means from an academic perspective to also be engaged in work and practice, and whether or not that was appreciated and respected in their university contexts. And so this session, we're looking to explore pracademia in education and also what that means as pracademics. Over to you, Deb.
Thanks, Trista. So Trista, Paul and I have been working on a definition of pracademia, and this is the official definition that we've come up with. It's quite lengthy because we've been exploring all of the kind of things that we think that space or that concept might encompass. But on the next slide is sort of the main points around what we're thinking about with this definition, that pracademia is actually a space or a plurality of spaces, a multiplicity of spaces. It's also to do with identity, and it's a way of being, behaving, and becoming. It's a way that we exist and interact and engage. And it's both potentially sitting astride to worlds, but it's also can be about moving between. So there's an action and a place and space and an identity aspect to this. So when we've looked at it, we've looked at the fact that we think that as we think about pracademia, it involves identity, community, and engagement.
So these three areas, or these three concepts that we're exploring in relation to pracademia, act as, I guess, a framework to start exploring what pracademia might be, but also what it might offer, both to those that might actually identify as a pracademic, or those that may be operating in the space that could be called pracademia. So as the definition, as Deb discussed already, the idea of identity, community engagement are all elements that need to be explored in order to start to understand or start to conceptualize what pracademia is and what it offers, but also it highlights the interdependence of these three things as well. Identity, we're going to go on to explore about how that relates to how the self is situated within the spaces or the domains that an individual might be operating in. The community, the membership, how people interact within those spaces, and actually what membership an individual may hold or may not as a result of whether that's the predominant identity, the predominant space they may be working or operating in, or how the community actually influences that construction of identity, whether that's as a practitioner, an academic, or a pracademic. The engagement element as well, which we'll go on to explore, is thinking about actually, well, what is this complex interplay that's actually happening as a result of how an individual might identify, but also how they engage within the various spheres, domains, or communities that they're operating within, and what actually results from that. What's the collaboration that might take place? What influence can you exercise through the multiple membership or through operating in this potentially new space or redefined space of pracademia and potentially as a pracademic?
So in terms of that notion of identity, for me, that's around the situated and ongoing process of making sense of ourselves to ourselves. It's been called by Lawler a slippery concept and by others hard to define. And there's a lot of work around identity being about multiplicity, that we navigate multiple identities at multiple times. Holland and colleagues call it imaginings of the self in worlds of action. And Wenger in his work on communities of practice talks about belonging, legitimacy and membership, as well as knowledge, ability and competence, in terms of that we actually construct our own identities and construct our notions of ourself and ourselves around where it is that we feel that we belong, where it is that we feel that we have some influence or are influenced ourselves. So that situatedness of identity becomes really important when we're thinking about pracademia and what the communities or spaces might be. And Paul will talk a bit more about that.
So as we begin to explore identity in particular, we have to think about, well, how is this, or how are an individual's identities, or identity in the singular form, how are these actually constructed, and how are people influenced in terms of identity construction based on the spaces they're operating within, and the sense-making process that happens within these spaces, between them and across them. So we can see that obviously within the domains and the spaces we operate within, there's various ways we can engage in knowledge construction, mobilization, but also how we engage and share that knowledge in the various forms and the various domains that it exists in. We see this exists already. We know there's various networks and possibilities of how people cross these boundaries or how they interact across different spaces. And we've seen already as well that actually people may hold multiple memberships of these different communities and spaces themselves as well. But ultimately, the reason we start to apply this to ideas of or concepts of pracademia and the pracademic themselves is because traditionally, when we're talking about multi-membership, or we're talking about the various identities that we may hold as professionals, as individuals, as educators, they still rely on traditional conceptualizations of what it means to be a practitioner, an academic, or a policymaker. And while an individual may be straddling these different spaces where they traditionally operate, what pracademia may offer is a way of actually understanding differently, or reconnecting or reimagining how people actually operate within these various spaces, what that means for the individual, but what that offers for these respective communities or spaces themselves as well. So pracademia, by exploring identity, exploring the community, and then how this goes on to connect with the forms of engagement that may result from it, this gives us an opportunity really to start to reconceptualize the domains themselves of practice, policy, and research, how we actually understand those, what they mean, what their function actually is within systems and across systems, and think about how do people actually negotiate these spaces? How does that connect with their own sense of self, the membership they have of these different spaces? But importantly, how is this happening already? We see that there's people that are doing this based on need. We see people that are doing this based on interest and desire. So ultimately, how could reconstructing or re-understanding or reconceptualizing the various domains themselves, but also developing a concept of pracademia itself as well, how does that help us serve the function of what pracademics can offer? How is that happening already? How could this help us achieve the things that we want to achieve beyond the traditional notions of the crossing the bridges between practice and research, filling a gap? Actually, it's much more complex and I suppose iterative than that. How could we explore the possibilities this could actually offer through the multi-membership, or through identifying the space of pracademia that bridges all of these, so we can achieve the goals that we want to achieve, whether that's already manifest through how individuals are actually mobilizing or crossing these boundaries already, but actually how could this new space potentially give us new opportunities or help us reimagine the possibilities that are available to us. And Trista's going to go on to talk about what this engagement potentially could look like.
Sure. Thanks so much, Paul. So in this last part of the conceptualization of pracademia, we look at what actually is happening in the sense of knowledge mobilization, engagement in the work that we're doing, how we come to the decisions and around sharing out our research, the problems of practice, the questions we ask, how we choose different methodologies, and the purpose. And so, as you see in this this image, it's building on the work of Susskind from 2001. An academic from MIT was exploring from a law perspective how the work that and negotiations, the work that he was doing both in academia and also in his practice work were fitting together. So we've built upon this idea of situating these different sections and quadrants of how we think about and describe the problems of practice, where and how we explain these problems through the theory building, and then the choices that pracademics make about how to propose and rationalize recommendations, and where do we report and present, in what areas do we select, and how do we negotiate our engagement for ourselves and for others who would be interested in the work. And then finally, moving into the fourth quadrant is implementing the proposed recommendations. So the problems emerge from practice, and also how is it impacting and influencing the work, and then what happens after. So there's that sense of executing these proposals and seeing the impact of that as we move along.
It's interesting to come to this metaphor now. We have been exploring 3 different metaphors for how we might think about pracademia, using metaphor as a tool for sense making or for conceptualizing this complex kind of idea. And this is probably the simplest of those, the idea of the bridge. And some of the things Tristan and Paul have just said seem to undermine the simplicity of this metaphor, because it's that on the left, you've got that notion of quite a lovely bridge that bridges two worlds, which is how some of us might like to imagine the work that we're doing in terms of bridging work. But then on the top right-hand corner there, you've got a bit of a messier bridge, so it's sort of a cobbling together of ways of bringing together or crossing the boundary between 2 worlds, that notion of the boundary spanner. And in the pretty sort of picture in the bottom left, you've got that nice little orange rock, which is the missing, or the link that holds together those 2 archways. And so thinking about potentially the pracademic space as a bridging space, a bringing together of 2 worlds that currently exist that we might want to bring together. But it does play in a little bit to the dualities that potentially exist in some thinking around this. And I guess we are starting to think that that notion of duality and of bringing 2 separate things together is actually a little too simplistic.
So perhaps a way to think about it is that it's being intertwined and there's a fluidity to it. And we've selected the Mobius strip as one way to think about it, because when you cut the Mobius strip, you see that and pull it apart, you see the 2 pieces are intertwined, but there's that fluidity and you can't be broken apart. So perhaps in terms of pracademia, it's a space that's interconnected, fluid, and maybe we don't need to be pulling these places apart, and it's its own construct and metaphor that we can use to explore these different ideas working together as this combined entity as we move forward. Or perhaps,
for those that are Game of Thrones fans, you'll, I'm sure, enjoy this metaphor, or if you're a bike fan as well. But actually, what this could actually offer us is a time to stop and rethink the whole idea or our whole understandings of the respective domains, whether it's policy, practice, and research themselves, and start to rethink this completely about what perhaps pracademia could actually offer us. So the question that this metaphor might actually offer us is about, well, is this a chance to stop and redirect the traditional outlooks or the trajectories that are offered by the domains themselves of policy, practice, and research? Is actually maybe about breaking those and start to reimagining how we could piece this together in different ways to reach very different outcomes. It's also thinking about the idea that perhaps we do need to reconceptualize these particular domains on their own themselves anyway, given the fact that the world that we operate in as educators is drastically shifting, as it always has. But we think about the fact that we're operating in times of shifting socio-political context, we've got constitutional uncertainty, forced migration, crisis, conflict of values, negotiating a post-truth era. What's been at the centre of all of these is the role of educators to respond to them. So what we need to start thinking about is, do our conceptualizations of the domains of policy, practice, and research actually go far enough, or are they sufficient in offering us solutions or response to these big challenges? Or could it be that actually understanding and theorising a new way of looking at these spaces, maybe that's in the form of pracademia, could this actually help us rethink and reimagine how we tackle these challenges within the domain of education?
And so to summarise some of those things that we've been thinking about and the questions that we're still left with, it's around purpose, it's around whether or not what exists currently works for this concept, if this concept is even necessary. Is there a reimagining that we need, or is it that we need to think about what Pracademia brings to education, or what we might need to recognise, amplify or grow as a space, or not? So we're still thinking these things through. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.